Hey, everybody. Thanks for jumping on today. I am about to be joined by fitness explorer Daryl Edwards, and I see that he just hopped on and he just sent me a request. So here I'm going to add him, give you guys a few minutes to hop on while we connect. Hey, how are
Hey,
you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Good, good. Thanks for joining me. I'm so excited to get a chance to chat with you, especially with everything that's going on. I thought it'd be a great time to just have kind of an open conversation. I know that you're going to go through a lot of history with us, and I think people are going to find that very beneficial. But I
Yeah.
think it's a time where we need to have open dialogues, especially in the health and wellness space, because this is a space that traditionally, and sorry, I'm trying to adjust my camera because my head's like chopped off, but there we go. But this is a space traditionally where not a lot of people of color have been in for various reasons. And so I think that people may be seeing people protest or whatnot and not actually understand what's going on behind the scenes, just because this is not a topic commonly addressed in the health and wellness industry or space or anything like that, really. And so I think it's an important conversation to be had, just to start the dialogue and continue the dialogue. You know, that things don't get solved in a night. And so these really need to be ongoing conversations at the forefront, um, I think, of our day-to-day lives. So for people who are just joining, I want to introduce Daryl to you. I'm going to read his bio for those who may not be familiar with his work. Daryl Edwards is a former investment banker, technologist turned movement coach and author. He is the founder of the Primal Play Method and physical activity health and play researcher. The Primal Play Method fuses evolutionary biology with the science of physical activity and play psychology. Daryl wants to inspire humans, regardless of age, ability, or disability, to transform their health by making physical activity fun and engaging. His work has been featured on documentaries, TV, radio, podcasts, and international press. Daryl is the author of the best-selling book, Animal Moves, and has released a range of fun fitness cards for adults, juniors, infants, and office workers, along with fitness professionals, and it's called the Animal Move Decks. He is regularly presents as a keynote speaker at events worldwide. His April 2019 TED Talk, Why Working Out Isn't Working Out, has now been viewed over 650,000 times. If you haven't viewed that, it's great. It's one of my favorite TED Talks to date. And Daryl resides in London, England, and publishes about playful living on primalplay.com. So with that, Daryl, thank you so much for being here. And I want to kick off because you honestly just did a live on this subject not too long ago. And I thought how you kind of just broke down the history of racism it was phenomenal. So I'd like you to delve in and kind of dive in and talk to us about some of the history, so people know that this just really isn't about the recent events that have happened. That things have been going on years in the making in the background that people aren't necessarily aware of.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, thank you for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to talk about this. And I think we need to put this into an historical context, because so many of us, regardless of our heritage, are ignorant of the history. We may have heard of the slave trade, we may have heard of apartheid or segregation, but that may be it. And what many of us don't realize, and why there is this lack of understanding, is because we don't realize that race is a social construct. Mm-hmm. It's not a genetic construct. Genetically, there isn't a biological definition or genetic definition of race, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So all humans are 99.9% similar genetically. You know, I want to stress that point, 99.9%. Secondly, there is more similarity between one ethnic group and another than within an ethnic group. So that's also quite important to note. So I can have something genetically more in common with somebody from Asia than you and I.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah.
And probably the last point to mention in relation to that is, which I think is really, really fascinating, is that there is more genetic diversity between 35 chimpanzees than all 7+ billion humans on the planet. These facts in relation to our genetic heritage is one of the points that fascinates me about the human race.
Mm-hmm.
In 1500 or so, there had to be a justification for the acts that were about to be enacted by the Europeans. Mm-hmm. So the start of exploration, this like really nice term used to describe those who discovered the new world, which of course had always been there, but it was new for the Europeans. And the driver for riches and for greed and for conquest. So after this, there was a religious mandate, there was a royal mandate, permission was granted by the church, by the Catholic Church in Portugal, by the Spanish royal family and the Portuguese royal family, to be able to go to these lands and not only trade between the inhabitants for riches, but actually to annihilate the people, the First Nations people. And the only way that could be justified, given that the scriptures, the Old and New Testament states that thou shalt not kill, how can we justify the need for this greed to be able to say it is okay for me to kill another human being? That was one of the reasons, one of the justifications of creating this classification of race, which meant that I, as a European, can kill someone from another region and there are no consequences. I won't go to hell. I won't be judged because I'm performing a Christian duty. And I have to see these other human beings where traditionally we had no problems with other humans in that way, based on this definition. We have to be able to justify this. So initially it was about the native peoples of those foreign lands that we decide they're of no use to us. That's the first. The second is when we wanted to harness the treasures of that land, which became tobacco, sugar, and a little bit of rice, but also cotton. So those were the top 3-4 products that led to Europe becoming very, very rich. And this triangle of trade from the Americas, so that's North, South Americas and the Caribbean, back to Europe, to West Africa to obtain the labor, back to the Americas, and so on. So the Portuguese started the transatlantic slave trade. I have to stress, slavery has always existed. This wasn't started in the 14th, 15th century. Slavery has always existed in all parts of the world. But this is the first time slavery was justified by racial definitions, the first time. And again, the justification was similar. How can we say that it's okay to enslave another human being? The Catholic Church at that time had already abolished slavery within Europe. So you were not allowed to have another European citizen as a slave. So the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the French all took part, and of Belgium all took part in the transatlantic slave trade. And again, there was a justification in doing so, that they're not human, they're subhuman. We are superior. We are the masters. We're allowed to do this. We can use the conversion to Christianity as justification. We're improving the lives of those that we have conquered by this process. And we can view them purely as we would do any other item of stock that belongs to me as a human being. So that was the start of the process. Language changed. Pretty much all European languages started to use these terms of, black being evil, bad, white being good, white being angelic, black being bad. Language changed. Blackmail, blacklisted, it became part of the language, this view of the world of creating compartmentalization. That occurred pretty much also at the same sort of time. And the only way to sustain the amount of labor required in the Americas to justify this, and in the Caribbean, was by a huge free labor force from predominantly West Africa, where slave masters got phenomenally rich on the back of that labor, and the nations in those parts of the world were rebuilt to satisfy Europeans. So the natives were pretty much completely annihilated. African slaves were used to build property, to develop the land, to ensure that these goods were available to be shipped back to Europe, and those goods were traded with Africans. So again, let's acknowledge that these goods and these riches were traded with Africans, who then supplied slaves, and that cycle continued. And that's why I kind of focus on this history, because that was the start of this categorization. That was the start of saying we are better than you are, purely by this artificial construct of race, which didn't exist before then. And for people who want to challenge that, you just need to look, if you go further back in history, if you look at ancient Greek texts, the Roman texts, and you see discussions about Europeans trading with the Africans, and you see that within the Roman Empire, there were African emperors of the Roman Empire. There was no distinction based on your, again, social construct, based on your skin color. There was no distinction as to what you could or couldn't do. So even within the UK, we had one emperor, I think it was Septimius Severus, I think is his name. Excuse me if I haven't quoted that correctly, but he was buried in York, in England. He was involved in building Hadrian's Wall, which separates Scotland from England. He's buried in York. I, at school, was never taught about him. We weren't taught about this black emperor and his offspring, who were also part of the Roman Empire. And this was quite normal. He wasn't like a one-off. There were a number of emperors from other parts of the Roman Empire, and their status was based purely on their status. It wasn't based on skin color. If you go back to time of the ancient Greeks, very similar. One of the ancestors of, believe it or not, one of the ancestors of Hercules was of Ethiopian descent. So one of the Greeks married an Ethiopian, and one of her ancestors was Hercules. And this is all, again, very visible in those texts. The Greeks had no concept of white. They had no concept of European. They just had this concept of, you are from this location, we are from this location. We trade, we recognize the accomplishments and achievements of all of the humans that we have interactions interactions with. And again, something that's very disappointing, I studied classical history at school, very fortunate to be able to do so. And so we were taught, classical history from Greece, from the Abyssinians, from the Persians, etc., etc. None of that was mentioned. The Abyssinians, for example, you hear the word Abyssinians, and most of us are like, what is he talking about? The Abyssinians were from East Africa, right? Significant, big civilization. Those are the things we were taught, but we were never taught the context of where these people were from. So we assumed they were European, or of European descent, who did all these remarkable things and were the cradle of civilization. But that wasn't the truth. And so fast forwarding on, because many people will think, well, what's that got to do with us? 400 or 500 years ago, and you're still bringing this up? Like, really? Why is this important? Why it's important is because those original decisions that were made about my classification, right? So my classification based on my skin color means that today in 2020, I am treated differently than a lot of my peers, a lot of other human beings, purely on this basis. And what's the connection? The connection is even after the abolition of the slave trade. So in Britain, one of the reasons why we kind of have a different experience, the Black British experience compared to African Americans, is that most Black British are from, if we're from the Caribbean, that's where the slave trade, that's where the slaves were. So a lot of English slave masters were remote. They were in the UK just making money and kind of going, I have no idea what's happening in the Caribbean. We're removed from the atrocities occurring. And so that was one of the reasons why slavery was first abolished in Britain. With the first European country that says the abolitionists. The reason, one of the reasons it happened is because of that separation. People like this. How can we accept this happening? We wouldn't allow that to be happening here. So why are we allowing this to be happening? Thousands of miles away. In America, of course, the slave masters were there in residence with the slaves. They were in the midst of it. So imagine slavery is abolished, right? Shouldn't we be grateful because whites freed the slaves? Well, let me tell you something about this. When slavery was abolished in the UK, the slaves received no recompense for their labor. When they became free, slaves received nothing, not a cent, not a penny. However, in the UK, slave masters, both here in the UK and in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, received the biggest bailout that Britain has ever undertaken, ever. I think it was something like 50% of GDP was used to satisfy the previous slave masters. So not only did slave masters benefit from slavery, they also benefited from the abolition by receiving significant sums of money. So they could continue to be rich in whatever way they would choose to do so. The slaves, who now became free men and women, received nothing. And even after the abolition, slavery still continued for 20 or 30 years throughout the British Empire, even after that decision was made. So we have freedom, but we have no money, we have no land. We have to still continue to work for our slave masters. Slave masters would often charge former slaves significant sums of money to stay in their dwellings, to pay rent, to till the land for slave masters. I mean, imagine, I'm working the soil, you are receiving the benefits, the harvest, but I have to pay to be able to work on the land and not receive a measly wage, which I'm pretty much having to give you anyway. So that continued.
Mm-hmm.
What also continued is this subjugation by skin color. So the darker you were, the darker your skin, the harsher the treatment you had as a free person.
Yeah.
If you were the product of if you were the child of a slave master, and you were of lighter skin complexion,
Mm-hmm.
you had more freedoms. You may not have to work out in the field. Best case scenarios, you may actually inherit, part of what your master previously had. You may have had some riches. That division continued, and that exists very much today in many parts of the Caribbean, and similarly in the Americas.
Yes.
So that continued. That continued to the point where not only, with freedom, colonization occurred, which again still subjected the majority of the people living in those lands to remain in poverty, to not to be educated, to not be able to accumulate any form of wealth, to still have these divisions of superiority, inferiority in the 18th, 19th century, into the 20th century, into many of those countries becoming independent. That system still existed. And for people who just think it's just a European, African thing, or it's just a black or white thing, it isn't at all, because there was a transoceanic slave trade. Not many people talk about this.
Correct.
I only became aware of this several years ago. I had no idea that slaves were taken from East Africa, initially by the Arabs, then by Europeans, by the Portuguese, to India, to Indonesia, up to Sri Lanka, to other parts of Southeast Asia. I had no idea. I also didn't know that the Portuguese also trafficked slaves from Japan, from China, to Portugal. And those slaves were treated better than African slaves, again, based on the color of the skin. And the Catholic Church banned slavery for those groups after some time, well before the slave trade for Africans was abandoned. So like even that aspect of history, and for people to assume, it was just you Africans that were involved, were the victims of this. No. We just happen to be the largest victim by far, mainly because of the transatlantic slave trade. But there was this transoceanic slave trade that continued. And of course, slavery still exists today. We know it exists. Right. Okay, but it's just not on the same scale. So this justification, this classification into the 20th century, into the science of eugenics, where they was trying to justify why Africans are subhuman, why they have less intelligence, why the Jews are subhuman, why we should treat, this started at the beginning of 20th century. The science kind of caught up with trying to justify what we already knew for a few hundred years. Now we've got more science to back it up, head measurements and all these things that were used. And so that justification that previously was about the slave trade became nationalism, famously known, we know from, National Socialists in Germany, the biggest example of that, one of the biggest examples of that in the 20th century. But that was used to justify the Holocaust.
Right.
Not many people know that a lot of black servicemen who were fighting against Germany, so some of the colonies of the French and the British, like the Caribbean, there were people fighting of my heritage against the Germans, who were also subjected to the horrors of the Holocaust, who were in concentration camps, who were in gas chambers. It wasn't just the Jews, even though, of course, overwhelmingly they were the majority. But there were, you know, those of kind of Romani descent, you know, the Gypsies, for example, you know, some Slavic heritage. They were also subjected to those horrors because of this classification of the purity of the Aryan race. So they still use these same ideas of classification, but the Jews in that instance was the prime target. But those of African descent certainly were too, and they included, you know, the handicapped, the mentally handicapped, you know, the physically handicapped or disabled were also part of this of that approach. So next, okay, that was the Second World War. You know, we've moved on from there. But of course, we had segregation. We had the Jim Crow laws. We had the laws put in place after slavery to ensure that somebody of African descent couldn't truly be free. You still couldn't be free. And if you were an immigrant, a new immigrant to the US from any other part of the world, you would still have a much better experience, even though it was harsh, it was difficult. You would still have a much better experience than those of African descent, because those laws wouldn't affect you. Those laws of segregation, those laws which would say you and I cannot sit and you know, in the same location. We can't be on the bus unless you're at the back and I'm at the front, and I can be at the front. So those laws were, again, pretty much meant for people like us in terms of skin color. Apartheid, again, another system created based on this superiority, inferiority. To the present day, people wonder, well, why? Okay, right, we know we had laws passed in the late 60s, Civil Rights Act in the States, the Equal Opportunities Act in the UK, apartheid's been abolished. Haven't we made so much progress that the world has moved on? Yes, the world has moved on. But this system, the foundation of this system, which was built 500 years ago, I have to stress this, it wasn't there prior. It wasn't there prior. 500 years ago, it is still part of our DNA. It's part of us. Part of me, part of every single human being on the planet is subjected to this system in some way. And there are some of us that unfortunately do benefit without realizing it, even if they don't want it. They are privileged. They have an advantage on this basis. And that's why this is a really difficult conversation, because some people will just say, well, hey, hold on a second. I have nothing to do with slavery, had nothing to do with me. I've got nothing to do with racism because I'm not racist. I've had lots of problems in my life. So it's not only black people that have issues. Like I've got all these issues that have happened in my life. You know, I was poor. And the one thing I'd like to state to my experience is this is the kind of the problem. If you take a very poor person of European descent, because I don't even like saying white people actually, because this perpetuates the problem, because we're all humans. But if you take somebody of European descent who's very poor, right? And that person gets a certain qualification. They have a CV, right? They have a resume, which has a certain level of qualifications. And you put them in an interview panel. That person is more likely to be seen based on their name. That alone, you have an advantage. Oh, this person, yeah, they sound like they're worthy of an interview, one. Secondly, they're more likely to be given a fair hearing at the interview. Third, they're more likely to be hired. Fourth, they're more likely to be promoted. Five, they're more likely to be paid more for doing the same job. And there are a whole raft of studies based on what happens if you have the identical CV, the identical resume, but this person is identifiable by another heritage, right? Or you change the sex of the person. So instead of being male, they become female. And interestingly, the number of interview requests drops. You know, if they are taken on, the salary expectations or the salaries given are lower. And if you then add this additional categorization of, okay, what if it's now a black person?
Mm-hmm.
Then they may not like to be seen at all, right?
Right.
And so there's one study which states that the equivalent of qualifications, it might take you 9 additional years to achieve exactly the same level of salary and of job status, even with exactly the same qualifications, exactly the same experience, work experience. It will take you 9 years longer to achieve the same status, purely based on your heritage. So these are some of the advantages that people aren't aware of. And when I think about my background, when I think about my childhood experiences, and I think, well, okay, I was a child. That was back in the 70s. You know, the world was a lot worse then, and I just need to work hard. If I work hard at school, like my mother told me to, everything will be fine. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. My parents came to England with my grandparents. My grandparents were farmers from the Caribbean. They came with my parents, who came here as teenagers. My mother instilled, especially my mother and my father, instilled in me the importance of education. I went to a school called a grammar school. So grammar schools here in the UK are based on basically your, IQ, academic ability. Okay. So you pass an exam at 10 years old. It's 11 usually, but I passed a year earlier. And you go to grammar school, and you get a remarkable education without having to pay for it. So we couldn't have afforded private education anyway, like education you have to pay for. So I had a remarkable education, but I went to school which was predominantly, not black. I was like one of very few students in this school. I was subjected to a lot of racism at school, from teachers as well as my peers. And again, I kind of accepted this as, this is just the way it is. I have to work hard. I have to put that to one side. I have to not let that distract me from what I want to do. And at that time, I wanted to be a doctor because that's what my mother told me I had to do at 5 years old. And my mum's still really upset that I didn't do that. But I loved computers. So I loved computers more than the human body. And so I decided I wanted to become a computer programmer. And I decided I wanted to work for the biggest, most successful IT company on the planet, who is Microsoft. Once I started working in this field, if I told you the amount of interviews that I had, where I would always get, to the last 2, the last 3, where people would see my address, that would be, I wish I had a different address. Because incredibly, I knew if I put my address down, they would say, oh, you're from this location. We don't think you're going to fit in. So I put different addresses down. My name doesn't suggest my heritage, Darrell Edwards. So that got a foot into the door, in the door. Right. So, but yeah, I'd have so many interviews and I'd build up so much experience. And I'd get told by people, it's just not going to work out for you here. It's just not going to happen. Your salary expectations are too high. It's like, what do you mean? This is what you're advertising. I don't understand. But anyway, I got an opportunity. I got a job. I decided I wanted to work for Microsoft. I remember turning Microsoft down. That's how successful I became in the work I was doing. Microsoft came back, headhunted me a few years later. I worked for Microsoft. Then I was like, I'm not making enough money. In technology back then, you weren't paid that well. So I was like, I need to get into finance, investment banking. Again, if I told you the amount of excuses that I was told as to why, sorry, you didn't go to the right university. Sorry, your parents, don't have the right level of education. Like, what? Sorry, you don't have the experience in finance. Well, you told me to come for the interview, even though I didn't have the experience. But now that I'm here, you're telling me I don't have the experience. Right. Then I've got some other experiences of being offered jobs over the phone, like being begged, literally, can you start today? Don't come next week, is too late. We need you here like today, this afternoon. So you have an interview in the morning, very, very in-depth interview, very technical. Like, I don't think I've got the job. This is really, really difficult, really demanding. You've got the job. Please come in. You get to the office. Oh, sorry, you're Mr. Edwards. Yeah, there's a misunderstanding. Don't, there isn't a job. What do you mean? I was told this morning I've got the job. Well, you walk into the office, the typing stops, everyone turns around and looks at you. You get told, we just don't think you're going to fit in. Maybe the commute's too far for you. Like, well, I can make the decision if I want to commute here or not.
Correct.
So I had lots of those experiences, and incredibly, I put those down to, maybe it wasn't about racism. Maybe there was another reason, because you want to feel you want to think the best of people. So you think, okay, you know what? I'm going to get even more. I'm going to work even harder. I'm going to get more qualifications. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have more experience. I want to make sure that they can't say no. So that's what I decided to do. I'll do everything I need to be the best that I possibly can. And I still had those experiences. I'll give you a couple of more really quickly. Like one time I was asked to work at a satellite office. Mm-hmm. And I would be the most senior person there. And I got to reception, and the receptionist said, "Oh, you need to go into the back room and change." And I'm like, I'm wearing a really nice suit. That's all I'm going to say. I really looked after myself in the garment department.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm like, I'm dressed to the nines. You need to go and change. I'm like thinking, okay, well, that's a bit strange. What? Right. I'll go and get changed then. What have I got to, And then I go into the back room and I'm like, there's nothing. I can't see. What am I supposed to change into? Go back to reception. It's like, go literally like, just what are you doing here? Go and get changed. Anyway, I realize that it's a changing room for the cleaners. And I come back to the desk and I'm just like, no, actually, I'm not a cleaner. I'm actually going to be managing the site today. She panicked. Let me call, So there was all this like, and I'm thinking I could, there's lots of people who I could fire. I was kind of like, I'm kind of having enough of these situations.
Yeah.
But it was absolutely abhorrent, and I had lots of those issues. And the last interview situation was me sitting in reception, day one of the job, and I'm sitting. There were two people next to me, and my manager, who was going to be my manager, came down, went to reception. Oh, where's Mr. Edwards? Oh, he's sitting over there. My manager comes over, or prospective manager. He looks at me, he looks at my left, looks at my right, and he goes to the person at the left. Oh, Mr. Edwards. And he's like, no. And he's like, okay, I'm sure she said it was you. He goes back. Where's Mr. Edwards? He's right there. So I see her pointing at me. He's right there. He comes over, he looks at me, looks at the person to my right. Oh, Mr. Edwards. And I'm like, I'm not going to tell him it's me because I want to see how this plays out.
Right.
He goes back. She's like, he's over there. He comes to me, head down. He's like really embarrassed. Like, oh, I'm really sorry. There was a misunderstanding. And I'm like, no, there wasn't a misunderstanding. I was here. I saw and I heard everything. And he was just like, please do not speak to human resources. Don't, I haven't got a racist bone in my body. I promise you, And again, I knew I could have made more of that situation, but it was just another event of scores of events like that happened to me in the professional field. And then not only was it happening professionally, but it would happen outside of work. So as I moved neighborhoods and I moved, into bigger apartments, into nicer neighborhoods, and drove a nicer car. And every time I had an upgrade of car, thinking, you know what, I'm going to be stopped less by the police now because, I'm surely they're going to view me as being respectable. Oh, no. I got stopped more frequently. The reasons for being stopped, they were more reasonable when my car was battered. When it didn't, my car could just about run when I bought my first car. But as the cars became more expensive, and I ended up driving like an Aston Martin. So if you know anything about sports cars, they're like they're nice sports cars. They're Aston Martins.
Okay.
I had an Aston Martin, and I'd be stopped for you're driving too slow, you're driving in the wrong neighborhood. Why are you parked outside? Oh, because I live here. Like, you know,
Right.
why are
Right.
you stopping in this street? Oh, because I live here. Don't be cheeky. Like, no, I'm not being cheeky. I'm
live
kind of,
here.
you know, I'm saying it in the nicest possible way because I'm aware
Mm-hmm.
of what can happen. So I'm saying, like, you know, I actually live here, you know, like, so how can you afford this car? I work really hard. I've worked hard for it, you know. So you feel as if you're being reasonable, but any rational answer is just making this individual more and more irate. And it wasn't an exception. That happened a lot, and you realize it's a collective experience. So a lot of my friends would say exactly the same thing. Oh yeah, that happens to me as well. And you realize those things weren't happening to people of other heritage. You know,
Right.
it wasn't happening. So yeah, you would almost laugh about some of the reasons for being stopped, you know, and
Right.
you'd also second guess, like, hold on, have I been drinking? What? Well, you don't drink, Daryl, so you know that's not a problem. You know, oh, I don't smoke. Yeah, I don't smoke. I don't do drugs. But I would play through those things, like, oh, maybe they think, well, Daryl, you don't smoke, so what are you worrying about? You're not a drinker, so that's not a problem. The car's yours, you know, like, you don't
Right.
have any points on your license, you don't have any outstanding ticket, you know, there is nothing wrong, like, relax. Yeah, oh yeah. Actually, yeah, there is nothing wrong. But those incidents would continue to happen. And then we in the health and wellness space, which is what this talk is about. I left my former career because I got sick and tired. I got sick physically,
Right.
and I wanted lifestyle to make the difference. I didn't want to take the medication, and I cross-trained. I did nutritional therapy. I became a personal trainer. I wanted to develop this system of movement, which is fun and accessible and inclusive. And then you realize, and you think, I assumed actually, because there's this benevolence, there's this like, oh, we want to help people, because that's a superficial message you hear. I assumed that this world would be far more embracing and diverse and open. And then you realize, you know, initially I was like, well, it's because I'm just starting out in a new field. What do you expect, Daryl? You know, you've only been doing this for 5 minutes. You've got to expect there to be lots of barriers. But then you realize, okay, I'm building with experience. I'm creating some influence. I'm creating an audience. There are people who really admire my work. I'm doing something which is very innovative. And it's not just because I feel that way, but I'm getting told this. But yet you're seeing people, you know, certain doors they're either slammed completely shut, that really shut, or there's a little window of opportunity. And then you kind of go, oh, I'm here. And then you realize, but it's only me. And then you think to yourself, well, hold on a second. If I've been doing this for a few years, there have been people doing this for a lot longer than I. Why aren't they here? There are people who are not doing this as a second career, like me, but that's been their career choice for 2 or 3 decades. They're not visible. You know, why am I in the US? You know, imagine that. I'll be at a conference with hundreds of speakers, and I might be the only non-white person as a speaker. And I'm not even African American. You know, like,
You're coming
why?
from, yeah.
Yeah, I'm coming from London to because I want to be involved in those events. You know, I have something to say, but again, you know, I have to ask myself, why is it so difficult? Why is whenever I talk about diversity and inclusion and about, hey guys, look, there are audiences that we should also be targeting. We can tailor our message to make sure that vulnerable communities have a piece of this pie. You're shut down immediately. I've been called a communist, like, you know, openly, because I've been talking about creating this environment of wanting to help those who need more help than many people who are here, who've already, we've already drunk the Kool-Aid kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
We're already
Right.
singing from the same hymn sheet.
We're already,
We've already
yeah.
taking action. And there's all these people that we say we care about, but we don't do anything to make it, to help those people. Like we really don't. And we have so much power and influence. Let's do something about this. So I noticed that personally. I've noticed that when I've spoken to other persons of color and they have similar experiences, and you kind of go, okay, it isn't unique to me. And then you start seeing these parallels of what it was like in my old world. And I kind of thought, well, that was banking. You know, that was very cutthroat. You know, you kind of, old boys network. I can kind of understand it. But then you come into this new space and you go, is that really happening here? Then you see what happened with COVID-19. Yeah. And a lot of people kind of saying, it's your, it exposes this elitism again. And this visibility on certain voices are the ones that are important, and almost saying it's your fault. If you get sick, it's your fault. You know, if you're in a vulnerable community, it's your fault. And if you just came here and did what I did, or bought my program, or bought my book, everything would be fine. Not realizing that there are people who can't afford extra virgin coconut oil. There are people who don't have time to listen to podcasts, who can't read books because they're just too busy trying to do their second or third job. You know, like this is kind of reality. And then after COVID, this is where it hits home. When I've seen influencers, people that I really admire, and I'm really grateful and thankful for those who allied with us. They posted the black squares. They've been sharing posts. Some people who I'm surprised that they did. I'm like, oh my goodness, well, I had no idea that person would do that. But then you see the vitriol of hate in their comments of people telling that influencer, that white influencer, I'm going to stop following you. But not only that, I'm going to burn your books. You're now a terrorist. I'm going to unsubscribe from your programs. I'm no longer going to do your coaching certification. And as well as all the hate. So the hate that's targeted to this individual because they're saying, hey, let's do something about this. They're getting this heat. And then they're also spewing all of the normal troll hatred towards persons of color that then they feel that they're able to do. So you have that happening. Then you have the response, which is either censorship. So, you know, 50% of those people have just removed the comments, just deleted, you know, like suppressed. Oh, no. There aren't people like that in the world, you know. And I'm kind of like, no, leave those comments there. Let people see them. Let people understand this is what it's like all the time. You've just done this once by saying, I want to help. I want to be part of the solution. And look what happens to you. And you are also white, and you're getting all of this hate. And then I remember me thinking when I posted, I remember thinking, I'm going to lose lots of followers. You know, I've got lots of followers, you know, and I'm going to lose some followers. You know what's really interesting? I remember saying to myself, I didn't even say to myself, I don't care if they unfollow me. I remember thinking to myself, is those people probably aren't following me anyway. They probably, you know, they already made up their mind when they saw my profile. They're like, oh, that's the guy. You know what? I don't like you. Whatever you have to say, Daryl, because of your skin color. So I'm like, actually, I haven't lost followers. I've actually gained followers, you know, and I'm actually quite surprised that I have. So it's really interesting. So I've seen a lot of my friends who have posted in a way that is genuine and sincere, because there have been a lot of insincere posts, but there have been a lot of people who have posted very genuine posts who really want to help. And it's unfortunate that they're getting this, and some I mean, really unrepeatable, vile comments of the worst type. It's abhorrent. And I would just say, for those who do want to help, one, please don't stay silent. Please, that's the worst thing that you can do. You know, this is a real issue that affects us all. We are all impacted by this. We can't ignore this. And if with George Floyd, and of course George Floyd is just one name, it's just one person. You know, Tamir Rice at like 11 years old with a toy gun was killed. Playing with a toy, 11 years old, he was killed because of this systemic issue with police brutality. So please don't stay silent. Please ally with us who are victims of this, who face this regardless of what we do. You know, I couldn't have done anything to change many of those incidents of being wrongfully accused of things. You know, I've been to stores returning items that I purchased of very low value, and almost before I got in, as soon as I got into the store, and I would do things like, I need to make sure I see the security guard before I go into the store. I'm almost like, hey, look, I'm showing you the item.
In with this.
I'm walking in, you know, like I'm gonna go straight to the checkout. So, you know, I'm not gonna wander around the store. I'm gonna go straight to the checkout, you know, because I want to get a refund. And I remember the last time I did that was here in the UK. A few months ago, I did that. And I knew what was going to happen. It was my local store. I'm like, they know me. They see me in here all the time. And I live in a nice, you know, a really nice neighborhood in London. I'm like, I was like, I've got a feeling what's going to happen. This item, which cost £2.99, you know, like $4 or something like that. You know, I almost said to myself, should I just throw it away? So I basically bought some fish, and it had gone off before the sell-by date, right? So I was like, I actually contemplated throwing it away because I knew it was just going to be hassle trying to get this refund processed. and I was like, no, of course that's not going to happen. Darryl, stop being so paranoid, stop being so sensitive. Anyway, I get there. As soon as I go into the checkout, supervisors called, managers called. So where did you buy this? I bought this here, you know, like went through the whole process. So you want a refund? You know, no, I don't want a refund. I just want some fresh fish, actually. So I don't even want the money, stop the money. You know, then it's like, oh, well, we don't have exactly that. I was like, I don't care if there's a price difference. If it costs more, I'll pay the difference. If it costs less, that's fine. I'm happy, you know. So I made it as easy as possible, but it was like the most difficult experience. And I felt like a criminal, and they made me feel that way. And people were looking at me as if I was causing this problem. And the good thing is, I remember thinking, as soon as I get home, I'm not standing for this. I keep on accepting these incidents. I called the head office. I explained what happened. They said, we'll get back to you. No one got back to me. I called again. They said, oh, the store manager will get back to you. The store manager called me and said, oh, don't worry, Mr. Edwards, we've initiated this disciplinary proceedings. I'm like, oh, that's great. I'm like, okay, tell me what happened. I'm not just going to accept. I'm like, tell me exactly what you did. Of course, nothing had happened. Right. But I kept on pressing. I spoke to the store manager. You know, I was like, this is the principle. I don't just want the money. You know, they were like, oh, we'll just give you a gift voucher. You know, I'm like, no, that's not what this is about. It's the principle of how I was made to feel, you know, just because of this. You know, I know exactly why that whole incident occurred. So, yeah, it's a far bigger problem than just health and well-being. Right. But given that BAME communities here in the UK, so BAME stands for Black and Asian ethnic minorities, and those communities of people of color in the US, we suffer disproportionately from so many issues. And in terms of health and well-being, we're more likely to die. You know, a Black woman is more likely to die of breast cancer than a woman of European descent. We are disproportionately affected by COVID and all of the complications. We're more likely, frontline nurses and doctors here in the UK are more likely to die if they're a BAME in the BAME community. Ridiculously disproportionate. And there are all of these kind of systemic issues that people aren't really willing to address. And you know, those reasons are not genetic. You know, there is not this genetic predisposition that you're more likely to be susceptible to COVID-19 if you're non-white, right? You know, so here it's like if you're Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, Chinese, African, Caribbean, like basically if you're not white, then you're pretty much twice the risk of dying of COVID-19. And when you do get to hear the voices of nurses and doctors, they will say things like, we're more likely to be sent on the front line without PPE. You know, we're more likely to, if we complain about the fact we need PPE to work, you're more likely to be disciplined. You're more likely to be suspended. So, you know, so there are people who are being forced to do the right thing, i.e. don't complain and just get on with your work, but they're putting their lives in jeopardy for sure. So yeah, in you know, it does, as somebody who now spends a lot of time looking at the research, and you kind of go, you know, I did suspect originally, when you look at things like type 2 diabetes and you're told, you know, somebody of African descent, Afro-Caribbean descent here, you know, you're twice as likely to get type 2 diabetes and complications, somebody like myself. And I took those at face value. I was like, yeah, you know, there's probably something genetic which increases our risk, our predisposition. But when you look at the research, when you actually go to other countries that are predominantly of African descent, why are they not at the same levels of risk as, say, somebody here in the UK or in the USA? Right? Why is the increased risk tend to be in the countries where there is this systemic and institutionalized racism? So you start to tease apart the what they're trying to say is a genetic difference to actually a socio-economic, the differences in healthcare, the differences in treatments being offered, the access to good, healthful food in food desserts, and, you know, no Whole Foods in my neighborhood. And, you know, those are the realities which creates this difference between health outcomes. And it's very stark here in London. If you go from East London, which is predominantly, you know, like ethnic minority populations, to West, average life expectancy, there's a 20-year differential. 20 years. So you can go on the metro line. So literally, there's a line called the District Line that runs pretty much from east to west, and you can go from the end of one on the east to the west, and there's a 20-year difference in life expectancy. 20 years. And of course, there's lots of reasons as to why, but one of the biggest designations as to why that is because it's socioeconomic.
Right.
You know, that's it. Increased risk of cardiovascular disease, of cancer, of type 2 diabetes, of stroke, of all these things. And so, again, when you've been to many conferences and summits, and the only things people tend to talk about are food, you know, exercise, wear the right type of glasses, you know, do the latest kind of hacks and this, that, and the other. And you kind of go, hold on a second, why is no one talking about socioeconomic problems? No one. You know, why is no one talking about the perils of smoking? You know, it's a significant risk factor for, you know, and poorer communities tend to smoke more than other demographics. Like, why aren't people talking about those things? Like, why is it only about just the level? If you just consume less carbohydrates, everything will be fine. If you consumed no animal foods and just went plant-based, eureka, the world would be a healthier place. You know, if you just did what I did, everything will be fine. Like, no, that's not the
That's not
solution.
the only thing.
Yeah,
Correct.
that's not the whole thing. Of course, those things do make a difference. They
Mm-hmm.
do improve your health. They've improved mine.
Hey, I'm hopping back on. We reached our time limit. So let me see if Daryl is still around. I guess, and if you're doing a joint, you have an hour long time limit. So let me see if he hops back on here because we're having a great discussion. There we go. And then I'm going to open it up here and address some specific questions. So let me see if it connects. Hey, it's that hour joint thing.
Yeah, I just got so carried away with passion.
No,
So
it was good though. I think it's one for people. I want to address some specific points to take away, and I was able to save it, so then I'll make this like a part 2, and we can splice it together.
yeah,
But I think one, when people they see the riots, they see the protests, they see everything going on in America, and I think people really believe that racism is an American problem. It's a US thing. It's something that just people in the US deal with. And I think what you illustrated so eloquently is that it's not just a US problem. It's a world problem, honestly. And
yes,
these things are swept under the rug. And sometimes it goes unnoticed because maybe in that region the demographic you might only be 1 or 2% non-white or whichever race or ethnicity you pick, and so those things are more likely to be swept under the rug. It's just kind of not talked about. I I think what has happened with the death and murder of George Floyd was that it was caught on camera, and you literally witnessed someone begging for someone to stop their killing, and they didn't stop. They finished it. He pled until he died, um, and people saw that, and I think it struck people like, what are we doing here? What are we doing? This isn't a anti-police movement. So I think that's, people want to label Black Lives Matter as a terrorist movement or a fascist or whatever you want to make it, and that's not what it's about. It's about, as you went through earlier in the discussion and kind of outlined just the history, the race as being a socialized construct, a way to be able to justify slavery in a Christian religion where it was not justified. I mean, and I know people point to the Bible and say, look, they had slaves in the Bible, but we're talking about when the slavery, the recent, in the last 400, 500 years started, where initially, other Europeans by the Catholic Church were not allowed to own other Europeans, because that was wrong. And so
yeah, yeah,
how you had to go through and create a construct to designate a certain group of people as no longer human, thus being able to justify the inhumane treatment that was about to occur. Well, we still
yes,
have some of that lingering now. And so, well, that person might be bad, so I'll shoot them. You have people dying for non-violent offenses, where it's like, okay, even if you did have a counterfeit bill, last time I checked, while that may be illegal, it is not a death sentence. It shouldn't be a death sentence. It shouldn't be a death penalty. And so this
yes,
thought still is in the forefront, whether it's intentionally, subconsciously, whatever it is, it's that, well, that person is not my equal. And so it's okay for us to get it wrong. But we're talking about the getting it wrong are actually people's lives. But it is okay to get this wrong. You know, it's okay for me to shoot first and ask later. It's okay for me to do a no-knock warrant and enter someone's home and kill them in their own home. It's okay for someone to call and, you know, call the police and want them to do a welfare check, but the person ends up dead. It's okay to do these things because we'd rather have X amount of those happen than to risk the life of, you know, someone in law enforcement. And so the thing is that certainly people go on and out of their house every day. They put on the badge and they wonder if they'll come home that night. And the truth of the reality is they may not come home that night. And so it is not to take away the fear that police have for their lives and the fear that police families have for their lives. But we also have to recognize that you have a certain subset of the population who are afraid that, is this my last jog I get to go on, minding my own business? You know, is this my last time I get to play in the park in the playground? Tamir Rice got shot for being a kid playing with a toy gun. You know, is this the time where I get pulled over? And if I do have a concealed weapon and I acknowledge to you that I have a concealed weapon, but I sneeze, you think I'm twitching, do I get shot for that? And these are things that do happen, and they're not isolated incidents, and they happen over and over and over again. And at what point do we say enough? What point is there the accountability? And so when people look at, you know, Kaepernick and, you know, kneeling and he's disrespecting the flag, he was not disrespecting the flag. He actually, the backstory a lot of people don't know, he actually did speak with war veterans and different servicemen and saying, what is the most peaceful, respectful way? That's why he kneeled. You know, that's what the kneeling was about. But again, we get uncomfortable when we talk about these things. We don't like how it makes us feel. And so it's very easy to, rather than in 2016, when he did start kneeling, rather than to dig deeper into the reason why he was kneeling, the police brutality, you know, instead of looking into the reason behind that, it was spun out of character and saying, you're being anti-American. You're disrespecting war veterans. He was not disrespecting war veterans, but it was to deflect. And so now you fast forward 4 years later, and all of this has just kept boiling over. It's kept happening. It's being recorded, you know, filmed. People here, there, that, you know, and now the response is, well, why can't you protest peacefully, right? Well, those were peaceful protests in 2016, but then organizations were giving backlash. The NFL, all these people losing endorsement deals. A bunch of Georgetown players wore shirts that said, I can't breathe during warm up. You know, people said that was disrespectful. So it's like, well, I'm not sure, you know, protesting and raising issues of injustice, it is uncomfortable. And so I'm sorry, there is not a way to call out behavior but make you feel good about yourself, because it is an injustice. And so we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we have to move these discussions forward because it is a problem. And so the Black Lives hashtag, you know, and people using that is not to say that if you're not Black, you don't matter. You know, that's another way people spin it. And it's not to say that Blacks are not also worried about Black on Black violence or things in you know, in our own communities. And that's something I'll commonly hear too. People deflect and they say, well, you're not upset if it's a Black person that kills a Black person. And I said, you know, that's not true. But all the work that's going on in the community isn't publicized. The things that are happening, those aren't publicized. And it's not mutually exclusive. It's so I don't understand why people think that you can't be involved with protesting Black on Black crime and be against police brutality. You can be against both because both are issues. And so I would think that the place that where we need to, there's a lot of places where we need to start, but obviously having a discussion about it and just first acknowledging it's a problem. And no one's saying that all police are bad, but you know, in the medical industry, in the aviation industry, name several different industries, there are quality review processes that go on all the time. You know, we have to obtain maintenance and certification for medicine. We have to go through and make sure you're still up to date. You still know what's, you know, you're improving, you're constantly improving, you're constantly learning. And so I don't think that there's anything wrong with holding police to that same sort of standard, you know? And so, because they do have people's lives in their hand. And so because of that, we should want increased accountability, increased sensitivity training, increased de-escalation tactics. Why does it have to be a gun? Why does it have to be a chokehold? What other methods before using deadly force can you exhaust? If someone's running away from you, do you really have to shoot them to make the arrest? Why? You know, and these are the questions that deserve to be asked and should be asked, because we all have to be held accountable. And so I think
very good points.
And I think that's where people are missing the mark with some of this, and to see the hateful comments that are, as you mentioned, are being posted in the health and wellness space, whether it's the plant-based space, the keto space, the paleo space, the fasting space, whatever space, when you have people of Caucasian descent who are influencers, who are speaking against police brutality, and then they get inundated with hateful comments because they're trying to speak up, it just shows you that the problem is not imaginary, and it's not just a US problem, it's not just a UK problem, it's a you know, it's a world problem. It is a public health issue, and as you mentioned, you cannot truly talk about health and wellness if we're not willing to admit the role that health disparities play into preventing people from achieving true health and wellness.
Yes, for sure. No, I totally agree, and I think it's really important to understand the history, understand why we're here today, and recognize this is a humanity problem. You know, I have, you know, let's look at India, for example. You know, they have a prime minister who's definitely a Hindu nationalist, and if you go back just before kind of COVID really hit the news, if you just have a look at the news 2 or 3 months ago, what was happening in India, the rioting that was taking place, people basically being lynched in the streets because they were not Hindu, because they were, you know, usually kind of Pakistani Muslim descent, you know, and a lot of African students were also involved with what was happening. So this is, you know, again, I know the prime focus tends to be what's happening to African Americans in America, but I do feel that I could be George Floyd. If I was there at that time, there's a few years difference between him and I, that could have been me. And I think empathy is certainly one of the things which is missing. You know, we can separate ourselves and go, it doesn't affect me. It's over there. it's better for me here in the UK. You know, our police in general don't carry guns. You know, I'm unlikely to be killed by gunfire in the UK. That's you know, that's the reality. But it doesn't necessarily mean things are better. And there's this one study in relation to the differences between a black person hearing the news of an unarmed black person being killed and a white person hearing the news of an unarmed white person being killed. And the difference is quite a large study, but they basically found the outcome was that a black person is more likely to internalize that event and consider themselves being that person, or thinking that could have been my brother, my son, my father, my uncle. A white person is more likely to say that was an independent, isolated incident. It had nothing to do with me. And so one of the things I've been thinking about recently is the mental health, the additional mental health burden that many of us have, because we are thinking about that could have been me. We do become more anxious, as you say. Every time I take certain actions, make certain decisions, we have to consider both dual outcomes.
Right.
And yeah, I've thought about that recently. That this additional burden of anxiety and panic that you have to suppress, but is still there. And that could also be another factor in that additional chronic stress that many of us have, because I have seen not just George Floyd, I probably see hundreds of videos a year, unfortunately, of these things happening, and you kind of dwell on that, and you might think, oh, thank goodness it wasn't me, but you spend some time thinking it couldn't have been me, and how awful is that, and I wonder why that happened. And so I think it'd be really good for people to be able to empathize and not only just say, wasn't that a tragic incident? Isn't that awful? Isn't it an awful example of humanity? But instead say, what if that was me? What if that was my brother, my cousin, my partner? What can we do to help ensure that things like this don't happen again? How can we reduce the risk of this? What legal reform do we need? Like you mentioned with police brutality, what needs to be put in place to make it, as you mentioned earlier, like to ensure that there are consequences. If there's a legitimate case of police brutality, what are the consequences? Just being fired isn't good enough.
Correct.
Right? Correct. Just being suspended, usually with pay, isn't good enough. They need to be called in some respects to a higher level of account, because they have a responsibility to protect, to serve and protect. They're being, the taxpayers are funding their salaries. So there needs to be a difference in accountability, I would say. We have an independent police commission here in the UK. And again, policing isn't perfect. The justice system here isn't perfect, but I feel there is an additional layer of accountability, which gives us some sort of recourse. It's probably one of the reasons why we don't have lots of examples of these excessive cases of police brutality. But and in the UK, it tends to be in custody, actually. So when there are no witnesses, that's where people tend to be killed by the police here in the UK. Most of it tends to be in custody, where no one can see what's happening. It doesn't tend to be in public spaces usually. It's certainly not going to be killed by gunshot. Like those are rarities. So yeah.
No. Well, and I think, obviously Daryl and I don't speak for the entire Black race or the entire Black Lives Movement or the entire health and wellness space, but I know someone had posted a question earlier on just, they were Caucasian and posted a question saying that, they want to be an ally, but they don't know where to start. They always feel like they say the wrong thing, and then people are mad at them, and et cetera. And so for me, and again, this is for me personally, I think sincerity goes a long way. And the other thing is to start with just listening, because I feel like a lot of times people have, you listen, but you're interjecting or saying, but why, but no, we're trying to discount the experience. And so I think one, just start with listening and realize, it's not necessarily about saying the right or wrong thing. I think first is just listening and learning and being open to believe, or at least consider, that people's interaction with law enforcement and with other citizens at that matter can be influenced by the color of skin. And I think just listening to those experiences is a place to start. And then after you listen and just kind of learn that empathy and things like that, then I really do believe voting, I know I get people who look at me and they're like, but I do think voting, being registered to vote, making sure, this goes for all colors, making sure you are exercising your political voice, talk to your city councilman, think about whether, even if it's not on a national level or state level, what are people doing in your counties? What type of reform is going on in your counties? The local level is where we live our everyday life. I love one day, I hope to be on a national stage, and once COVID's over, you and I, Daryl, on a panel somewhere at some, big conference. That would be amazing. But the truth of the matter is, where I influence on a day-to-day basis is right in my community. And so for people talking to their councilmen and saying, hey, what is the city of, plug in your city name, what is the city of Overland Park, Kansas doing to address police brutality? What is the city of Cleveland, Ohio doing to address police brutality? And so start local, start around, and just, we should all feel safe when we see law enforcement, right? We shouldn't have a scared, feeling, or, what's going on. And people like to say, well, you only act scared if you have something to hide. No, I just feel scared because I can name countless and countless and countless of people whom had nothing to hide, who were going about their everyday life and ended up dead. That's why I'm afraid. I have nothing to hide. I own my car. I don't do drugs. I don't have anything on me, but still, when I get pulled over, I am nervous. I'm afraid, my license is strategically placed in, so I drive a Tahoe. So, I think it's probably supposed to be where your sunglasses go. It's this push compartment at the top of the car. That's where my license is. I don't have to reach anywhere. It is plain as day. I don't have to grab into my glove compartment. I don't have to open it. My hands are already up. You see both of them, and my hands have to go up in order to get my license. Why is that? Other people aren't thinking that. Other people aren't trying to strategically place their documents in their cars so that everything is out in the open, so no one can mistake for a second that they thought that they were reaching for something. And so I think just to discount these experiences, and I'm a professional, I'm a physician, but when I get pulled over, that doesn't matter, And so, or if I'm jogging at night, you can't tell that I'm a physician at that point in time. So I think the biggest thing I would tell people to take away from this is to be open-minded, listen, and then when you see a problem, obviously speak up, but really look into your communities and what type of legislation can we do, whether it's, you know, a training, additional training. I mean, we should all want additional training. All of us do this in our professional lives, right? I mean, Daryl, you are continuously revamping, I'm sure, right? And looking at the newest research with how to make the primal play method, you know, more effective, more efficacious, you know, get increasing health benefits, things like that. For medicine, I'm always reading different journal articles outside of, you know, the things that I now do for health and wellness in the fasting space and trying to keep up on that. But I'm also keeping up on, you know, how can I provide prenatal care in a more effective and high quality way for the women I care for? How can I care for those pregnancies better? And so, you know, it's not like I graduated, you know, in 2008 and haven't read anything since then, right? Because the science is ever changing. So I would say that also for law enforcement, getting continual training on diversity, race, ethnicity, continuing to have more training on de-escalation and how to use non-deadly force, continuing to train. This is not a one-time course you take and then you go, you know. So I think, again, just continuing to make sure that we are providing resources and tools so that the only thing to use is not the gun, right? That there are other tools and things like that. And so I would say people just keep an open mind and really, you know, just if you're tuning in watching this, to at least consider a different point of view and to take that back into what you do and recognize that the issue of racism, inequality, you know, sexism, being, you know, things that are faced in the LGBT community, all of these different things do play a role in your daily experience. And not only do they play a role in our daily experience, they affect our health. And if we're truly about health and wellness, it is true health and wellness of the body, the mind, the spirit. And to just completely ignore the impact that these social constructs have on our health, we're not targeting true health and wellness.
Oh, I mean, I really love that. And we know, I think it was 1947 and 1948 when the World Health Organization created this definition of health. And they basically said it's not just the absence of disease, but it's complete physical, mental, and social well-being.
Yes.
And that's why this is important. It's not just about the body and mind. It is about how we, you know, interact socially and how we feel in the social space. And so we need to be doing more to reach out and to listen to those who are vulnerable. And as a man, I think the only parallels when I think about some metaphors in relation to this, one of the things I think about is if a woman said to me, I've suffered from sexual abuse. You know, I was attacked, you know, 1 o'clock in the morning and I got attacked. And the first thing I said was, oh, well, hold on a second. You know, I've been subjected to abuse as well. You know, I was teased at school, or I was, you know, it's like, oh, you know, like, actually, no, this isn't about me. You know, this is about you, what you've been through and what you're willing to share with me. So that's the kind of first thing that I think about. The second is if I start to think about excuses. Oh, 1 o'clock in the morning, that's a bit late at night, isn't it? You know, what were you wearing? You know, like, was it really the other person's fault? You know, maybe it was your fault. So that's the second thing I think about in relation to this, right? And the third is actually, it is about trying to put yourself in their shoes. It's as real as that. So as a man, I can't understand all of the intricacies of sexism, but I certainly know it exists. I don't pretend that it doesn't.
Right.
And I know if I spoke to a group of women and I said, can you tell me all of your experiences? And it was free reign, open season. I'm sure there would be hundreds of incidents that they could talk about, from the relatively trivial to the very, very serious. And I would be, hopefully, would be shocked and sickened. And if they, you know, that's what I would want my reaction to be. And I suppose that's what I would want from somebody of other heritages to think about. Like, oh, so that's what it's like to have that feeling, have that fear of, you know, driving your car at night and not being stopped, or going for an interview thinking, I've aced everything, you know, like I couldn't do anything else. I have all the attributes for this, but then get told in the nicest way possible, no.
Right.
I would hope people would try to imagine what that's like for themselves, even though they haven't had that experience. So don't feel scared to ask. I know a lot of people have been saying things like, do your own research. I mean, even that one, I you know, like, no, that's, yes, we people need to do some work, right? You can't have everything spoon-fed. But we've been talking about this for a long time. We've been frustrated because people aren't listening. And now you have some people who are like, we want to listen. Please tell us. Now we're prepared to listen. I don't think that's the time for us to say, well, we've been trying to tell you for so long, and you didn't want to know then. No, now's the time to go, okay, if you really want to listen,
let's talk.
Just please accept what I'm going to say. Here you go. Yep. And it's up to you now. Now that you have this information, now I've tried to transfer some of this experience. Hopefully that can enable you to take further steps that only you can take. You know, I can't hold your hand every single step of the way. But I think that's part of the unification process, really. It is like, you know, like Mandela, when he tried to unify South Africa, he could have been that president to say, it's a time of reckoning now, right? He could have said that. Now I'm president. Now we have the majority with the ANC. I'm going to make sure the people who were in the power base beforehand are gonna feel the punishment. No, he embraced. He said, let's talk about this. Let's see what we can all do to move forward. And it isn't perfect, and it isn't a seamless process. And I'm not advocating any of the violence that's happening. But if there's anything we know about American history, and actually if there's anything we know about a lot of history, is that the biggest changes tend to come through these type of protests. You know, the riots after Martin Luther King's death. Does anyone know, who's listening, how long it took for that last stage of the Civil Rights Act to be passed? 2 or 3 years before Martin Luther King passed, lots of discussions, no agreement. It's not going to happen. There was so much resistance from the South that it couldn't be passed. Within 5 days of Martin Luther King dying and the subsequent riots, it was done and dusted. The suffragettes in the UK, no one wanted to give women the right to vote. Like, no, what do you mean? No, we're not giving you the vote. They had to protest. They did it the peaceful way. People weren't interested. They had to make more of a louder shout, you know, like, this cannot go on. So again, I'm not advocating this, but I feel that if we didn't, there's a Dr. Zoe Williams here in the UK who said that, you know, if these riots weren't happening, this probably wouldn't be a discussion point for many. You and I probably wouldn't be having this Facebook Live.
Right.
If this wasn't a continuous, do you know what I'm saying? So I think that's the only thing that you know, that this may be a catalyst for change,
for change.
because the world is seeing that, oh my gosh, this isn't just a 5-minute blip. Like, it's not, doesn't seem to be an endpoint here. Even like, look what happened with the NFL today. I mean, that wouldn't have happened. You know, the NFL
No.
basically said it's okay for players to protest by bending the knee.
Peaceful
You
means,
know,
right,
like,
by peaceful means, and they spent 4 years fighting it. They still owe
yeah,
government an apology, but yes,
yes,
they it's crazy. And I think the take home is everyone, you know, I think a lot more eyes have been opened now with everything going on. And it would be a travesty if we just went back to the status quo. The status quo is not acceptable. It hasn't been acceptable for some time, for years. But I think to go forth now and continue to turn a blind eye, it's almost sinful, honestly. You know, you see
yeah,
that people are that there is a disconnect in the human experience, solely on skin tone, solely on that, and that it's, you know, it's not okay. And I don't expect that there will be a day, and maybe I'm pessimist, you know, racism, sexism, all of those things, they're not going away. But we don't have to continue to let them be acceptable. And I think that's what we need to do. And so I would encourage people, especially at your local levels, to see what you can do. I am going to have to hop off, but it was, I mean, the discussion I think was fantastic. I'm going to save this. I was able to save the first part. And so they'll both be in, on my profile, but I'm going to also bug my husband to stitch them together, because he can do video editing, and put this all together and put it out on YouTube so that you guys can watch it later. Because I think it's something that if people are willing to listen, even though it's hard to hear, just to have empathy, consider a different point of view. And I think before we can truly address a problem, we have to acknowledge that a problem exists. And I am encouraged that it seems like now finally people are willing to admit a problem exists. So thank you so much for you know, talking and speaking with us, Daryl, about your experiences. And thank you everyone for watching, who's tuning in, and thank you just for being open-minded. God bless. Have a good night.
take care. Bye bye.